I don't know how to introduce myself. I have done lots of things over the years, but I seem in the last few years to have become what I think I call an accidental Brexitologist. And certainly I think the things that people on this call are likely to know or be interested in relation to me are the Brexit blog, or what is now called the Brexit and Beyond blog, that I've been writing since 2016, and also possibly the Brexit Unfolded book, how no one got what they wanted and why they were never going to. And in fact, I think I talked to this group before, and I gave a talk which I think was sort of derived in some way from the book, which I think I called Brexit Unfolding. So what I was asked by, or what I agreed with having to do was a title, a fairly sort of a fairly non-committal title, because we didn't really know exactly what would be happening when it came to give the talk. And I'm going to just put a few slides up, so just bear with me whilst I try to do that. So you should be able to see now on your screen, hopefully, the title, Brexit, where are we now and where do we go next? And I've got quite a few slides, but I'm going to sort of dance through the early ones quite quickly. So I'm going to say a few kind of thoughts about where we are, and then maybe try to spend a little bit more of the time talking about sort of making sense of that now, and in terms of thinking about possible future things as well. And so one thought, is just to say that I'm sure this is true for probably everyone on this call, that at the time of the Brexit referendum and the result, and it felt like a big shock, and maybe in some ways some of that has kind of faded. But I just think it's important to understand that it was a sort of a metaphorically speaking, a kind of seismic event with all kinds of aftershocks. And although almost after all these years, perhaps it's come to sort of feel like living in this, this is sort of the new normal. But it really isn't normal, and it's a situation which has such wide-ranging and in many ways sort of unpredictable kinds of effects that it's not surprising, perhaps, that simultaneously, it feels sort of disconcerting, but also at the same time we can almost forget that we're still only in the relatively early stages of what Brexit really means. If you think about the fact that it's only a couple of years since the end of the transition period, which was when in all kinds of practical ways the impacts of Brexit became clearer. So I just sort of thought I'd say that as a general point to begin with. And of course the other thing to say is that there are all sorts of ways in which Brexit still isn't done, and the most obvious of those is the Northern Ireland Protocol, which of course, as we know, is currently being, in a certain sense, renegotiated, or at least some of its terms are under negotiation, and a whole lot of other things as well, including the fact that the UK still hasn't introduced import controls on EU goods, and that's actually quite important. I sometimes see people saying, well, what does it matter, because we know that EU goods are of a good standard, which is a weird kind of argument to make in relation to Brexit, because it's kind of saying, well, we don't want to have EU standards, but we're going to rely on them. But in any case, it isn't really true, because one of the important effects of Brexit has been to lose access to various kinds of EU databases about, for example, animal health, which means actually that Britain is now at substantially, probably isn't unfair to say, substantially increased risk of, for example, the importation of things like African swine fever, for example. There's still been a postponement on one of the most ludicrous of Brexit measures, the idea of replacing conformity assessment marking and registration for marking with UKCA marking. I think has been put forward again now to, I think I might to say, the end of 2024, and for medical devices into 2025. Horizon Europe, which in some ways has become bound up with the protocol negotiations. All of the issues that are currently going on around the retained EU law bill, that people will be familiar with, and which has the potential both for deliberate deregulations, for accidental deregulations, and even when it is passed, assuming that it's passed in its present form, it's going to open up a whole, that won't be the end of things, because it will open up a whole series of future questions about alignment and de-alignment. We've got a review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, all kinds of other loose ends going on, data protection equivalence, that's in the gift of the EU, and that could be taken away. And then the more sort of, if you like, perhaps there's some tangible things about what actually Britain's place in the world is post Brexit. So Brexit is still an ongoing process, but within that, I think it's right, and not just right, but important, even crucial, to recognise that there was I think a very crucial shift in the course of 2022, or perhaps it began, towards the end of 2021, and I think what we saw in that shift, of course, it can't be relied on to continue, but still, the early signs are that the races have really quite comprehensively lost the kind of battle for the sort of post-Brexit narrative, in the sense that of not just the sense of a growing number of people thinking that Brexit was a mistake, but actually that almost the kind of the terms of debate have become very defensive on the part of the Brexiters, and it's almost no longer a matter of has it been successful, but what is the extent of its failure, or so often now we see Brexiters sort of saying well, yes, there have been some bad effects, but they weren't as bad as some people predicted, or something like that, which is a very defensive way of articulating the case. Certainly, there's nothing. Very little is there anymore of the kind of the triumphalism about Brexit from Brexiters that we sort of saw in previous times, and so in some important kind of way, they've won the referendum, but that's actually and they've taken us out of the EU. That clearly is not trivial, but they haven't actually. They haven't actually in any way, built support or built any consensus around that, quite the opposite. And that's happened, for a variety of reasons, but I mean, I suppose, crucially because of the evidence of economic damage. And we can see now, I think, how crucial that mini budget was under Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, which was in many ways certainly seen by the Brexiters as this, this was the mini budget which was going to deliver the fruits of Brexit, and it also, in a more diffuse sense, had we could call a certain kind of Brexity characteristics. In other words, the fact that it was so ideologically driven, the fact that it ignored all kinds of expert advice, that they got rid of the lead senior civil servant at the Treasury as a prelude to delivering it, that they excluded it off its budget responsibility, that they acted as if they acted as if there were no external constraints upon them from financial markets or anything else, that it was just a matter of blasting ahead. And so I think that in particular, as well as the sort of, which it obviously connects with, wider kind of cost of living crisis, unpopularity of the Tories and so on, that all, even if some of that isn't directly to do with Brexit, that it has all sort of become lumped together into a certain kind of narrative of Brexit having failed, certainly Brexit having failed to deliver the promises of it, and again, in a more diffuse sense, sort of an idea that it's increasingly sort of talked about that there is sort of Britain being broken and things not working anymore, and so on, and all of that really gathered. Well, obviously the mini budget was a particular episode, but it was gathering pace throughout the last year or even a bit longer. I mean, we could talk, endlessly about economic consequences, Brexit. I'll just sort of put up a couple of charts which probably will be fairly familiar to people. I mean, this first one is from the Centre for European Reform study, and this kind of what they call this doppelganger model, where they sort of map what's happened to the UK economy against a basket of similar economies that prior to Brexit performed in a very sort of similar kind of way, and you know, I mean, a couple of things on that which have had a lot of quite a lot of media coverage anyway. The idea that this was by June 2022, the idea that GDP was 5.5% lower than it would have been, and this is no longer now a prediction. It's an estimate, of course, and it's an estimate which could be a bit lower, but it could also be a bit higher, and some estimates indeed are higher than that. And this is really substantial money, right? I mean, you know, I mean, 2% would be a bad recession. 5.5%, you know, is obviously significantly more than that. And of course, this isn't cyclical stuff. This is constant recurring stuff that the economy will go on being smaller as a result. So that's the top left of those, as you look at the top left of those graphs. And I mean, the one which I think is causing possibly even more concern amongst a lot of people is the top right one, which is basically about investment, and really now suggesting a kind of sustained underperformance of the UK economy in terms of investment, which of course therefore has implications, knock-on implications into the future. You know, we have lots and lots and lots of other economic data as well on this. Just another, again, thing that's been sort of seen quite widely, OECD projections for UK growth in 2023. I think these have actually been slightly upgraded since this since this version, and I think UK growth is now maybe predicted at 0.1, 0.2%, something like that. But you know, but the basic picture is that, and of course the reason these international comparisons matter is because the Brexiters keep wanting to say, yes, but you know, all this economic stuff, it's all about Ukraine, or it's about COVID, or you know, whatever. Well, those things in particular. But of course, you know, the Ukraine war and COVID have impacted on almost every country in various kinds of ways. And so the question always is, well, why is Britain so much worse? Why is Britain recovering so much worse? What is the factor that is unique to Britain? And there may not only be Brexit, but the most obvious and biggest one, of course, is Brexit, and that's why the international comparisons matter. And then just in terms of looking at public opinion, and so this question, do you think Britain was right or wrong to leave the UK? And we can see there, you know, a pretty clear, gradual but clear trend towards the view that that it was wrong to leave the EU. Now, the final few polls in that, and this is an aggregate of polls from various different companies. I think the graph has gone a little bit haywire at the right at the end there, because I don't think there have been that many opinion polls published since you know, right at the end period. And it's also just worth sort of saying that because it's different polling companies, they use different methodologies, and some of them, and the ones in particular where you get the very high scores for mistakes, where you got the scores of kind of 60-61% for mistake, those polls are ones that exclude don't knows. So they obviously look slightly different, but still, you know, the overall kind of the overall kind of trend is towards something like high 50, you know, in the high 50s percentages, 57, 58%. People thinking it a mistake, and something like you know, something in the sort of perhaps mid/high 30s percent of people saying that it was the right thing to do. And then, which is not quite the same thing, of course, there are questions about, there's the issue about support for rejoining. And again, we can see and it starts at the same kind of time. We'd expect them to be linked to some degree. That there's growing support for rejoin if there were to be another referendum, and declining support for staying out. And so, again, there's quite a bit of variation in the polls, but at the moment, it wouldn't be unreasonable to sort of say that there's something like 50%, getting towards 50% for rejoining, and something now going below 35% for staying out. This is sort of partly to do, I'll maybe mention this in a couple of moments, but it's partly to do with the don't knows as well, because you can kind of see what's happened here is that the don't knows sort of begin to decline as the don't knows tend to convert to rejoins. So if someone ceases to don't know, they're more likely to say they want to rejoin than to say they want to stay out. But I think what is perhaps more interesting, and certainly I think quite important, is to look at that kind of opinion in relation to particular age groups in particular. And if you look there, if you can see the sort of the middle, it's kind of sort of a bluish sort of line of all voters. So this is the shift from February 2022 to December 2022. And so all voters goes from about 49% saying rejoin to something like 57%, something like that, going to rejoin. It very much in line with what we've just seen. But what we see there is that and so it's quite interesting to see the extent to which that includes people who were Remain voters in 2016 going up quite steeply from 75% to nearly 90%, but still notice that there's still perhaps 10% of Remain voters in 2016 who wouldn't vote, who wouldn't vote Remain in another referendum. We can see a modest growth of the number of Leave voters, moving from something like sort of 13% in February to something like 19% in December, who say that they would vote to rejoin. But the really interesting thing, I think, is the age group differentials and how steeply support for rejoin has grown amongst the 18 to 24s in particular, as compared to the very modest growth in support for rejoin amongst those who are 65 plus. Now, there's lots of things that we could say about that and to sort of make sense of it. And some of them, I think, are these. And one thing which I think is important, particularly for people who I suspect are most likely to be on this call, is that this is a real achievement on the part of people who, I mean, I put Remainer in inverted commas because it's always difficult now to say, should we be called Remainers or anti-Brexiters or rejoiners or whatever, but whatever you want to call them, who were more or less sort of told in 2016, well, suck it up if you don't like it, tough, you're crybabies, all the stuff that we're all familiar with. And the fact that people haven't done that has been, I think, really important in keeping the whole sort of debate about EU membership and Brexit alive at a time when there's been relatively little political leadership for it, so for the main two parties. And so it's a testament to that. And I would like to think also, that ultimately, fantasies and lies, political lies, do get found out and do get exposed. And in some ways, it's for people who are opposed to Brexit, this is quite favourable. Certainly, the demographics are quite favourable towards rejoining the European Union in the future. But I think we have to be a bit careful. I don't think we can sort of see a decisive kind of crushing loss of support for Brexit, and there's still a hardcore of support for Brexit, not just in terms of the population, but a hardcore support of Brexit within the sort of political and sort of media class, if you will. So it hasn't. It isn't as if the Brexit kind of project has completely and collapsed. You know, just because I say the narrative has kind of turned against it. That's not the same as a complete collapse. And presumably there will always be a sort of bedrock level of support for Brexit in the general population, as the sort of you know, probably always has been. I don't know what that bedrock is, but we probably haven't reached it yet. It's also not necessarily clear quite how stable the shift is towards thinking Brexit was a mistake and towards the issue of rejoining. I mean, you know, don't knows who have become rejoins or who've started to say it's a mistake. That may not necessarily be very hard shift, and it might quite easily sort of be reversed. And of course, you know, some of what's going on is sort of leavers being disillusioned. The whole issue about well, firstly about immigration in the true sense of the word, because many leavers have kind of noticed that actually total net immigration is no lower, possibly a bit higher than it was before. The distribution of where it's from has changed. And also, of course, because very often amongst Brexiters, there's a false conflation of issues to do with refugees and asylum seekers and that of you know, that of immigration, and so there are some leavers in polls who associate the kind of, you know, what they call the small boats kind of channel crisis, that they sort of see that as being emblematic of a sort of failure of Brexit. So those kinds of voters are not necessarily, or very likely are not kind of converted, even if they might say I would vote rejoin. They're not so converted to the idea of EU membership. And of course, although a lot of this stuff is quite good news for people on the sort of Remain or anti-Brexit side, also a lot of it is quite fertile territory for Farage, for the Reform Party, you know, who can kind of play on this sort of notion of, oh well, Brexit has been betrayed. It would have been fine if only it had been tried properly, and that it wasn't tried properly because of the obstructionism of the kind of Remainer establishment and the elite and all of that kind of thing. So the politics here is cuts in different kinds of directions. A referendum on rejoining the EU is not currently in prospect. There's no at the moment, no prospect of a government holding such a referendum. And I think the path to rejoining, if to the extent there is a path to rejoining, it's a long and uncertain one, and I'm going to come back to that and talk about it in a bit more detail. But it seems to me that for now, we've got this really kind of quite strange situation where politics is stuck, and that on the one hand, we've got this major national transformation, this earthquake, as I described it before, which has never been particularly popular with the public, and is now becoming less and less popular, and more seen as being a sort of a mistake. But we have a politics which isn't capable of responding to that or dealing with that, because it's stuck, because it is just almost sort of kind of locked up. The reasons for that, well, they're pretty well known. But as regards the two main Westminster parties, and obviously I appreciate a different situation in Scotland in particular, but in terms of the main Westminster parties, you've got a Tory party which is so split as to be a whole lot of issues, by the way, I would say, as to be effectively kind of unleadable. That overall, although the majority on paper looks quite large, it's never really been particularly reliable, like either for Boris Johnson and still less for Sunak, and that has an impact upon Brexit in some ways. One could argue a somewhat beneficial impact, to the extent that that there's so much tension between different kinds of Brexiters, as there always has been, between the sort of what are now becoming called sort of the Trussites, the Britannia Unchained, full-on deregulators, Singapore on Thames kind of people, who are very much also, we can see as kind of Brexit sort of globalists. And the sort of the traditionalists that are maybe associated with the Red Wall, who's a more kind of localist in orientation, that immigration is their main kind of concern. And there's always been that, we know that the Brexit vote in the referendum melded together these very disparate kinds of elements. And that still is the case for the Tory party now. Now, the reason I say that is to a certain extent a blessing, is because I think because it's because of that if they were completely captured by the deregulators, for example, then they would be able to pursue that agenda in a way that they haven't been able to thus far. And of course, within these splits, there's other kinds of issues to be thought about. The way Johnson is constantly lurking in the background, and so and always, would be liable to, for example, any kind of deal that's done over Northern Ireland Protocol, to sort of say, oh, this is a betrayal of Brexit, and so on and so forth. And as always, as indeed obviously has been the case right back to before the referendum, and partly explaining it, partly explaining it, this constant sort of external pressure from Farage and the Reform Party, which really matters to the Tories because of the fact that, that they have the potential to sort of skim off, 8, 10, 12, maybe 15% even of the vote at an election, even without themselves necessarily winning a seat. So one of the reasons we're stuck is the Tories can't admit Brexit has failed. It's their failure. They can't undo it. Certainly, in the Tories in their present configuration can't undo it. But they do have the capacity to make it much worse. And they show every sign of doing that with the retained EU law bill. And then, as I said earlier, that is then potentially the beginning of what use is then made of that. So they certainly can't solve the problems of Brexit. They can only make them worse. As regards Labour, well, they seem to be much more united, but extremely cautious. They can't come out and say Brexit has been a failure in terms, unless they are willing also to come out and say that they would reverse it, which they're not going to. And we know what they're not going to do now anyway, and we understand why that is, because of their own concern about their, about parts of their traditional electoral base. So what we're likely to see from Labour if they were to win the next election, they seem to be saying, well, there'll be a kind of a change of tone. It will be less confrontational. That's not a bad thing, but that's all it is. Potentially some greater alignment with the EU, maybe often quite quietly, and the particular sort of issue might be alignment over sanitary and phytosanitary regulation, which would be, again, would be a benefit, but would make a huge difference. And using the review process that's going to happen anyway of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement to perhaps deepen parts of the agreement, maybe a mobility chapter for service workers, and other kinds of regulatory alignment. So Labour are not going, in their present position, certainly, is not to undo Brexit, but they might make it a little bit less damaging, rather than making it more damaging. Maybe, and this is difficult to know, but there's certainly sort of certain kinds of rumours around of the idea that Labour are thinking in terms of a sort of a two-term strategy, and that what they would do post 2029 if they were to win a first, let alone a second election, might be somewhat different, might be somewhat more ambitious. And then there's also kind of questions about, well, what would happen if there was if there was not a Labour majority in the next Parliament, but a minority administration, perhaps with sort of Lib Dems, perhaps with Greens, perhaps even with SNP, although that Labour seem unwilling to countenance that idea. Might that perhaps mean moving towards a kind of single market position? I mean, it's interesting that Starmer recently talked about, I think he said, there was no case for single market membership, there was no political case for single market membership at the moment, which seemed to be an acknowledgement that it would be economically desirable, but that politically it wasn't possible. But that itself would raise certain kinds of questions about, would it require another referendum? I mean, people might want to say, well, no, it doesn't. That would fit within the mandate of Brexit itself. And that might be true, or that is true legally, but is it true politically? And how sustainable would that be if you still had a Tory party saying that they were going to come out of the single market. So, so what happens now? Well, you know, probably nothing much in some ways until we get to the next election, because of the blockage that I've just described. After that, well, it could get much worse. Imagine a future Tory government that was explicitly and united in having a majority for, you know, extreme deregulation, potentially even for not renewing the trade cooperation agreement, maybe even derogation from European Convention of Human Rights. Or maybe things get very slightly better, a future Labour government, maybe even a Tory government, you know, kind of muddles along with a bit more alignment. Or, and no doubt there's other scenarios too, and, you know, or the issue about rejoining the EU, or as I said, you know, potentially rejoining single market, or perhaps, and or having some kind of customs treaty with the EU. But I'll talk about rejoining the EU. And I think the thing to sort of say here is I don't think anyone can seriously suggest that this could happen without another referendum. And I think that for that to happen, the extent to which the whole kind of political class, and actually including probably many of us, have been sort of traumatized by 2016 and the aftermath of that, I think it makes it, you know, very unlikely that any government would really want to hold a referendum actually on anything, but, you know, on EU again for a long time. But I think for it to happen, we'd have to see sort of sustained, strong opinion poll support to have an referendum, and for rejoining, which is not the same thing, by the way, because there are quite a lot of people who there were certainly quite split opinions amongst people who favour another referendum about what timescale they think that's viable within. It would need to have a government that was elected, and I suppose that means a Labour government, unless there was a massive transformation of the Tory party, a Labour government that had in their manifesto a pledge to hold a referendum and to be elected on that. Well, there's no sign that they're going to do that in 2024, unless there's a massive turnaround. So the earliest for that will be 2029, and maybe not even then, maybe 2034. Maybe even longer, but, you know, we're getting quite a long way away in terms of time. What are the terms of that referendum going to be? I mean, it seems to me that if we get to the point where it's even in prospect, there's going to have to be a serious discussion about whether there needs to be supermajority, and perhaps also a majority in all 4 nations. Why? Because if we were to simply have a rerun of the referendum, and even if there were strong opinion polls support for rejoin, but when it got to the actual referendum, supposing there was a vote 52 to 48 to go back in, that would be a very unstable, you know, extremely unstable kind of basis on which to enter. So there'll be the issue about the terms of any referendum, and then of course actually winning the campaign. And I think the framing of that, I mean, we're getting a long way ahead of ourselves, but the framing of that would be very important. I don't think it could just be a matter of UK kind of going back with its tail between the legs, and saying, oh, well, you know, it's been so economically awful for us out of there, you know, we'll go back in just to kind of save our skins, as opposed to having a genuine kind of commitment to the EU. And a lot of what all this is about is also not just about the UK, but about the EU and EU27 being reassured that there's enough level quantitatively, but also a kind of a real and genuine kind of level of support, that they're not simply going to be back in the situation where a few years down the line, let's say a Tory government comes back and says, well, we're going to have another referendum because we want to leave again. And then thinking even further ahead, you know, it's not just one thing we'd have to learn from the Brexiters. It's just winning a vote isn't enough. That to coin to sort of to alter a phrase, you know, there'd have to be a sense of making rejoining work, and being prepared for the fact that this would need to be a different UK in what by then would be a different EU as well. And I think that this also suggests that this doesn't really happen until there's a new political generation of voters and leaders. And I mean, what is a generation? That's a somewhat sort of plastic kind of term. But I mean, I think if you look at those kinds of dates there, and the idea that you might get towards having another referendum in the sort of perhaps the second half of the 2030s, something like that, you know, you'd be sort of 20 years on from the 2016 referendum. And so if you go back to the image that I showed before about the demographics, and think about there, sort of, so in 20 years' time, those people who were 65 at the time of the 2016 referendum, you're 65 and over, they'll be 85 and over. In other words, you know, in many cases, therefore, they will be dead. And the 18 to 24s, and will be, you know, will obviously be an important presence. Of course, there are people even younger than them, and we can't necessarily assume that this will be a burning issue for them, and perhaps it will. And you'll also, though, have by then, you know, a different demographic of political leadership as well. And you know, all these kind of course, that's not to say there won't be new Brexiters in new generations as well, but all these kind of dyed-in-the-wool Brexiters, like, you know, sort of, you know, whether it's Farage or people in the Tory party like Duncan Smith or Bill Cash or all the rest of it, you know, these people will be substantially substantially out of political power by then. Now, I have seen people sort of kind of interpret what I'm saying here as being set as sort of saying, oh, well, so we just give up now and forget about it and just wait for the next generation to sort things out. No, because none of this stuff is going to happen inevitably. This is it will be possible for that you know, generation or half generation or whatever it will be ahead. It will be possible to do that only if they have the foundations to build on that are being laid now. And you know, if it comes about that in the late 2030s or late 2030s or whatever, you know, that Britain rejoins the EU and there are people, you know, in the streets, kind of, you know, laughing and sort of crying with joy and so on. Some of those people will, and some of us will be dead by then if that happens, right? But some of those people then, they will, I hope, and I'm sure, they will remember that the reason it has been possible for them to ascend that mountain is because of the fact that people, you know, ever since 2016 and now and all through, you know, the next however many years it would take to do that, have been consistently pointing out the failures of Brexit and consistently keeping alive the possibility and the idea and the ideal of rejoining the European Union. So to say it's a generational task isn't to say simply it's a task for the next generation, but saying that the stuff that we do now is the preparation that will both that will enable and make possible the rejoining in that kind of timescale. And of course, it may not happen, but if it is to happen, then I think that something like that is the set of issues that will have to be addressed before it does. So I think I've used up my time now, so I'll pause or stop. And oh, sorry, there was one last slide, which is just just plugging the blog. In the meantime, keep on top of it all by reading the blog, which I post on every Friday morning. Okay, thanks very much.